Welcome, Dr. Timothy Vance, Professor Emeritus at NINJAL. Thank you very much indeed for agreeing to interview with us today.
My pleasure.
So my first question is, and it's quite a large question, how did you come to study linguistics? And in particular, how did you come to study the Japanese language and Japanese linguistics?
When I was an undergraduate student, I went to a place in the United States called Washington University, and it's actually in the city of St. Louis. And I was very fortunate to have, at the time, a very young man who later went on to become quite a famous linguist. His name was Paul Hopper, and he was my undergraduate advisor. And I took some classes with him and enjoyed linguistics a great deal. And when I told him I wanted to major in linguistics, he told me that I had to study a non-European language. And this was a long time ago, of course, and not a particularly large university. So the choices were quite limited. I guess I could have done Hebrew, I could have done Chinese, but I decided to pick Japanese, not because I had any previous knowledge of Japan or was particularly interested in Japan. It just seemed it seemed like the fun choice. So you have to remember that at this time Americans were not even allowed to go to mainland China. So that I think that figured into the decision as well. So I began studying Japanese when I was a third-year student, a junior in college, and that's how that happened.
So how did you then come to work in Japan? Did you work in the United States before coming to Japan?
I did. So I went to graduate school at the University of Chicago, and so I was there for 3 years doing all of my coursework, and then I took the next 2 years and studied abroad in Japan. So that was the first time I had ever been in Japan.
Where did you study?
I studied at a place called the Inter-University Center for Japanese Language Studies. It's sometimes called the Stanford Center because their American business office is at Stanford University. But it's a consortium, mostly for graduate students, although we did have some undergraduate students. And so I studied there for a year, and then the next year I did my own PhD dissertation research, and I also worked part-time as a translator. So I went back to the United States, back to Chicago. I finished my PhD in 1979, and then I worked at several different places in the United States and taught for about 30 years. And then in 2010, right at the beginning of the year, I moved to NINJAL in Tokyo. So they had reorganized, and I was very fortunate to get an invitation to come and work there. And yeah, it was an easy decision for me. So I worked there until I retired in 2017.
And in terms of your working life, how did working in NINJAL in Japan, not just NINJAL, but in a Japanese academic environment and an American academic environment, how do they compare?
Yeah, it was very different. And because before then I had never worked in a Japanese university, it was not really clear to me which differences were due to being in Japan and which differences were due to being at a research institute as opposed to a university. But it was very different, no question about it.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, so I think one thing that struck me immediately was how bureaucratic the money management was. And it maybe that's really not a fair way to put it, but because American universities by then really didn't have much money to manage, so perhaps that was part of it. But yeah, the amount of documentation that was required and the care you had to take to make sure you didn't unknowingly violate some rule. That was quite different. I think now, looking back on it, I think that's probably more Japan versus the United States rather than university versus research institute.
And moving back now to your research, your actual research, Japanese linguistics, could you tell us about which particular aspect of Japanese linguistics your research concerns itself with, and how you ended up focusing on this particular part of Japanese linguistics?
Sure. So I guess maybe there are two answers. So one answer is that even when I was working on my dissertation, I got very interested in this morphophonemic phenomenon that everybody now knows as rendaku. And I had also been interested in experimental approaches to phonology. Not anything terribly sophisticated at the time, but basically psycholinguistic experiments. And so putting those two things together was sort of the the start of that big part of my interest. I was also interested in doing some kind of reasonably thorough, comprehensive description of Japanese phonology, which I didn't think there was anything in English that that would sort of fill that need. So that was important to me as well.
So you've written two general treatments of
Right.
Japanese phonology.
Right. The older one, which came out in 1987, is broader in the sense that it covers morphophonemic alternations as well as sort of the more sort of core phonology part of the system. The later book in 2008 only does the core phonology, so working out the phonemic system and that sort of thing. That book really was intended as a textbook for graduate students. So students that I had at universities in the United States, I field tested it with them, and it took many years before I had it in the kind of shape that I thought would be worth publishing. But yeah, that's the story behind that.
And what are you currently researching now?
Well, I just finished a long-term project studying the American geologist who did the earliest serious work on rendaku when he was in Japan in the 1870s. So his name is Benjamin Smith Lyman. And almost everybody who does linguistics or Japanese linguistics knows his name. But he was a very interesting character. So, something about his life and pretty detailed critiques of the work that he left behind. He was an amateur linguist. He was actually, his geology was his main occupation. But he wrote some very interesting things. So yeah, that is finally finished, and still shopping around for where to publish it. In recent years, I've done more work on writing systems. That is, how writing represents language. And as everybody knows, Japanese is a particularly good language to pick for this because the Japanese writing system is without question, the most complicated one that's still in use in the world today. If you go back and look at the ancient world, there's some interesting parallels, but as far as today is concerned. So that's a more recent interest, and it's occupying a larger proportion of my time than it used to, certainly.
And sadly, you're shortly leaving Japan
Yes.
for good. I think it's fair to say, and you've reached, it's fair to say, retirement age. How do you hope to be spending your retirement in terms of research?
Well, fortunately, my home in the United States is in Honolulu, and it's a short walk from my apartment to the University of Hawaii campus, and so it'll be easy for me to attend lectures and even take a class now and again if I am so inclined. So what I'm hoping is that I'll be able to continue working on some of the problems that still intrigue me. I've got some collaborators here in Japan who are interested in testing the idea that, without going into any real detail, the idea that the Japanese phoneme P somehow behaves with respect to rendaku as if it were a voiced obstruent. But there's never really been a straight up psycholinguistic test of that idea, and so it's not easy to do because whenever you do an experiment, there are all kinds of variables that you just can't control. So you just try to do the best you can. But yeah, so and that's going to take a while, you know. But yeah, beyond that, I think fortunately at this point in my life, I can sort of do whatever strikes my fancy. So I'm kind of looking forward to that. If I really were able to do it, I would like to spend about half my time in Japan and half my time in Honolulu. But economically that may not be realistic. But I certainly expect to be back in Japan many times as long as I'm able to travel. So.
Not including the paper that you published, which was based on your PhD research. I think your first published paper was in 1980 or 1981, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, I published a couple of phonetics articles about Cantonese earlier than that, but that was the first article about Japanese. Yes.
So you've been publishing for 40 years, basically.
Basically, yeah.
Looking back on your long career of publishing, which topic of research has given you the most pleasure, the most personal pleasure?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think maybe the one that gave me the most pleasure is the experiments that I did on Japanese verb conjugation. So whether native speakers of Japanese are able to conjugate made-up verbs following the patterns that appear to apply in real verbs, and the surprising result of those experiments. And it's always gratifying when other people get interested in the same topic and follow up on it and do other experiments. But again and again, we keep getting the same result, which is that native speakers of Japanese are sort of spectacularly poor at conjugating made-up verbs according to the patterns that we see in real verbs, and that's a puzzle. Why should that be? So, but that has always been fun.
And moving to the end now, what advice do you have for any young people who are interested in pursuing research in Japanese linguistics or Japanese phonology, and especially those researchers who are looking to do that research here in Japan?
Whether you want to stay in Japan or not, my advice is come to Japan and work on your language skills as early as you possibly can. The earlier the better, and the longer the better. And it's not just a matter of, I mean, of course, there's the practical issue of, you want your language skills to be as good as they can be. But while you're doing this, you will whether you seek to or not, you'll develop a network of people who are initially probably your classmates or your friends, but who will eventually become your professional colleagues in the future. And you can only do this in Japan. So I guess that's my answer: is come early and come often.
Okay, Professor Vance, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure. Thanks.